Well, I think we'll get started. Most important people are you, so thank you so much for coming. It's really nice to see so many people from different places, and we'll come together to talk about the work of Sarah Kofman. I wanted to start with some practical details, and then I'll just say a few things about Kofman and what we wanted to do in this conference, and then we'll see if that becomes a reality or not. I want to thank various bodies who've made today and tomorrow possible. So the Society for French Studies, the University of Reading, and the Institute of Modern Languages Research, who's hosting this here in Senate House. So thank you to all of them. Thank you also to Kathy Collins, who's just in an office up the way. If you need practical help, come to us, but you can go to her as well. And thank you to Jacob Batesworth, my co-organiser, who's
welcome. I'm quite shy, so I won't speak too much as John. I'm here.
Great. So, in terms of practicalities, there is a fire escape, which is the main stairs. That happened, sounds like it might go out. We have a video camera which is recording. So if you would like your talk to be sort of cut and sent to you that you can then distribute online and so on, please sign one of these forms which I'll leave here, and either leave them on the desk or give them to me or Jacob. If you don't want that to happen, then just don't sign it and don't worry about it. We can cover it over with a coat or something if it makes people nervous. Ceux qui sont francophones, n'hésitez pas à poser vos questions en français. Il y a beaucoup ici qui savent traduire et on va se débrouiller avec les deux langues. And then lastly, on the practicalities, you're welcome for lunch. We've got quite copious lunch, so it depends how much you eat, but lunch will be just in the end of the corridor down there. So please join us, both speakers and attendees. And then we're going to have a dinner at a nearby restaurant tonight, so speakers are invited to that, and attendees are also very welcome to come. But please just let me know if you'd like to come, so I can make sure we have enough spaces. Okay, so Sarah Kofman, I started reading her a couple of years ago, having read Lacoue-Labarthe and Rocher and so on, and I was just really struck by this author. On the one hand, and struck by how little she's been studied on the other hand. So I wanted to, along with Jacob, get people together and see what we can say about her work. It seems that she's someone who's got a lot to say about today, as well as to say about what was going on at the time of her life and her career. Specifically to say about how to deal with a hostile world. You know, I think politically, environmentally, and so on. That really seems to be the determining feeling of this moment. So how does Kofman help us to think about that? Is it through Stoicism, which she says various things about? Is it through narrative, whether it's tragic narrative or comic narrative? Or is it through politics and trying to change that world? And what are Kofman's politics? They may be less prominent than some other thinkers, but can we find them and can we decide what they might be? So all of this is sort of contained in the idea of relief, the relief of philosophy. Obviously there's a bit of a reference to the consolation of philosophy, the medieval, which I'm sure some people know much more about than I do. So this idea that the ideal world is more real than the material world, and by connecting to that ideal world we get a sort of caffeine hit, and it's able to make us cope with what's going on all around us. So I like the word relief because it gives us that sort of sense, it's a sort of soulagement, kind of like liberation from whatever might be happening. I also like it because it retains the French relève, being extensively discussed by Derrida and others, meaning literally to lift up, relever, but also to relieve somebody of their duties, like a guard taking over from another guard. And that relève itself translates German Aufhebung, to suppress, abolish, abrogate, but also to preserve, so it's got a negative and a positive side to it. And reading about it, apparently it's the word in German for when you're preserving vegetables. So if you're making a cucumber pickle, you say that it is aufgehoben, it's saved for later, it's put in store, it's transformed into something else. People have tried to say that Hegel was of Swabian sort of peasant background, and therefore that's where this all came from. I don't know if that's true, but it's a nice thought. Now, as we know, Sarah Kaufman had a life that was traumatic in many ways, traumatic experiences that we know about, but also we don't know about. As Nietzsche said, we can never know what that's actually like. So I don't mean relief to say that, yes, it's all sort of magically transformed into this thought system. In fact, it's almost the opposite of that, that relief can do that too. So it's almost as if she wants to relieve philosophy of its traditional status and its traditional form. And that's where we get the stuff around thought interacting with language, thought interacting with text, and thought interacting with life itself. So I think she's the person who asks how to live and how to philosophize within that life. When is the right moment to philosophize? She talks about that in the Gref thing, in terms of educational reform and so on. And she also talks about it with the question of dates. Now it is 25 years since her death, give or take a couple of weeks. And there are people here who knew her, 3, 4, 5, perhaps more people. So maybe that's an avenue we want to go down, thinking about that legacy and that responsibility. She quotes Nietzsche talking about his birthday, which also fell in mid-October, talking about autumn as a time of ripeness and plenitude and plucking and harvest. She also quotes him talking about Ecce Homo as the start of a new chapter. So it's not just a summary of everything, it's an opening onto something new. So does that mean we're here sort of trying to found Kofman studies or something like that? No, I don't think so. I think it's, yes, certain people have access to the archive and are working on that, but it's also much more multiple. We're coming from different directions, thinking from different perspectives. So I think that will be clear in what we're saying today. So I just want to close with, she quotes Nietzsche at one point saying that the more eyes, different eyes, we can use to observe one thing, the more complete will our objectivity be. So it's a sort of multiplication of perspectives, which we can see very clearly in her work, whether it's between the perspective of health and illness, strength and weakness, mother and father, mother and mother, father and father with Nietzsche and Freud, and so on and so on. So there's plenty of stuff to get into there, and I think we'll see the multiplicity come out in the different papers that we're going to hear.
Now we'll hear John McKean. So John is a lecturer in modern French literature at the University of Reading. He's written numerous articles on the relationship between philosophy and literature, and particularly on the work of Blanchot, Lévinas, Derrida, Nancy, Lacoue-Labarthe, Kofman, Barthes, and Proust. Today he'll talk about Kaufman and modern nature, from tragedy to comedy.
Thanks very much. So I'm handing around a handout with the quotations that I'll be reading. And I forgot to say before, there is another photocopy with the programme of the conference and abstracts and biographies for all the papers, so that will be your guide. There's some on the front chair and there's some just outside. Tragedy is everywhere and nowhere in Sarah Kaufman's work. Nowhere, because she devotes little, if any, time to particular plays or tragic authors, ancient or modern. Everywhere, because reading Kofman as she reads over the shoulder of Nietzsche, tragedy or the tragic allows the reader to move across large areas of her thinking. For instance, it provides an example of an art form rivaling the claims and status of philosophy. It stages the tension between thought and expression by the Nietzschean position of Dionysus and Apollo. And tragedy in Kaufman's thinking also raises questions beyond these ones. What is its precise relationship to medicine, catharsis and relief? Where does tragedy end and comedy begin? What is the best model for thinking the interaction of Dionysus and Apollo? And in what ways might her post-Nietzschean thinking of these questions be leavened, seasoned or relieved by her writings on Freud? Let's start with the relationship to philosophy. Rather than being a subgenre of literature, itself so often subordinated to philosophy's status, tragedy would be an alternative discourse of reason, a space in which reverberate questions around humans and gods, destiny, freedom, individual and society. In fact, its deep roots in human emotion and ritual would present it as a healthier specimen of philosophy, the latter having grown thin from its diet of abstraction, limited by schematism and what Nietzsche calls the cheerfulness of theoretical man. In any case, Kaufman has little time for the special status that philosophy has sought to reserve for itself. In Nietzsche and the philosophical stage, we can discuss how to translate that title, La Scène Philosophie. The main object of attention in this paper, she writes that this book would like to underline the essential affinity which Nietzsche perceived between theatre and the theoretical, the cathartic function common to the speculative and the tragic. This is to say that the difference in format notwithstanding, theatre and theory do the same dirty work of purging or purifying the emotions. In the same avant-propos to this work, Kaufman denounces the obfuscation of this aspect of philosophy. Comedians is what philosophers are, for behind the mask of morality, they hide their affinity with tragedy. Their philosophy is always a remedy intended to make the intolerable tolerable, to get over the contradictions and equivocations of becoming. Philosophy is a particular case of catharsis. Like tragedy, it aims, by means of its concepts and its veils, to lighten the load, to attain serenity. Here, at the same time as the ventriloquization of Nietzsche, we see some of Kaufman's most striking terminology in action. Negative experiences are gathered into the concept of the intolerable. The greater whole thus produced, according to certain claims, is called serenity. Along with jubilation, conversion, protection, and certain others, these give an idea of the way Kaufman is able not to break into any new, separate realm beyond the thinking of others, but by sheer weight of reading and rumination to sharpen their thought into a cutting edge. In what follows, we'll attempt to track her as she does this, looking first at the question of tragedy in medicine, then at the relation between Dionysus and Apollo, and lastly the borderline between tragedy and comedy. So the first section is on medicine between tragedy and philosophy. In Nietzsche metaphor, Kofman sets out that for the 19th century thinker, the use of metaphor was a sign of the abundance of life, an ability to remain independent of the weepy sickliness of abstraction. She writes, metaphorical style is the sign of a plenitude of life, just as demonstrative style indicates a poverty of life. The deliberate use of metaphors affirms life, just as the privileging of concepts reveals a will to nothingness, an adherence to the ascetic ideal. Accordingly, we find a number of medical metaphors being glossed by Kaufman in Nietzsche and the philosophical stage. Aristotle is said to act as a misguided or simply bad doctor, thinking he can purge something by the application of a homeopathic remedy named tragedy. Stoicism is described as a compressive bandage aiming to create a lack of sensation. And we find Nietzsche damning Kant and German philosophy with faint praise by talking about their soporific qualities, calming excessive sensibilities of the 18th century and producing a stupor akin to that of opium. The question for Nietzsche, however, is not simply that of selecting the right treatment for a particular condition. To do so would be to demonstrate that one's thinking remains partial and ambitious. True philosophy would not be something separate to life, to be applied to it in times of need. Instead, it would be life itself. In the following, Kofman speaks directly before quoting Nietzsche. Philosophy must be conceived of in an active and not reactive way, as an integral part of a healthy civilization to which it is attached by copper-bottomed laws, and in the bosom of which it holds a fundamental position. It functions preventatively. It does not cure one of illness, it prevents illness coming about. And then this is Nietzsche. The Greeks were able to begin in time, and they teach more clearly than any other people at what moment we must begin to philosophize. Rather than waiting for misfortune, as is thought by those who derive philosophy from discontent, it is from happiness that we must begin, in full virile maturity, in the fire of this burning lightness that is that of adult, valiant, victorious age. Although Nietzsche's terms might seem to view strength positively, in fact, they operate ironically. The more valiant and victorious the moment, the more important it is to philosophize, to separate oneself from success, to prepare for winter. This is to say that all strength is also weakness, that one is always the other, and we ought to link the two experiences above all. If we only philosophize when resentful or discontented, then philosophy risks being synonymous with that resentment and discontent. According to Nietzsche, this is what happens with Socrates, and then particularly with the onset of Christianity. Philosophy becomes a power of, this is a quote, becomes a power of discord and solitude. Decadence is marked by the formation of multiple sects, searching for individual happiness. Greek philosophy becomes Christian, essentially negative and reactive. It transforms into medicine, into a remedy against pain. The striking thing here is that philosophy must avoid becoming medicine, a separate facet of life, something applied to the suffering patient from the outside. The counterpoint seems to be that it should always be internal, always already underway. This can be seen as a demand for its institutionalization, and indeed in the contribution to the Groupe de Recherche sur l'Enseignement Philosophique, Kaufman unpacked this thinking, arguing against its allegedly crowning role in the curriculum and saying it should be present at all levels. In any case, the framework of comparison between philosophy and tragedy is clear. The key notion of catharsis is adopted from discussion of tragedy, even if Aristotle's aims in using it are rejected. Tragedy or philosophy are thought to be just as likely to exacerbate one's emotional status as to calm it. We can perhaps say there is no Nietzschean relief for philosophy if relief is understood as a cessation of something, or alternatively as in a bas relief, as a way of standing above it. Instead of a metaphor of height, perhaps one of internalization is more fitting. Good philosophy is philosophy of life, because philosophy is life. But to avoid that sounding mystical, which it apparently does, we must turn to the figure or figures in which thought is most fully realized, Dionysus and Apollo. In Ecce Homo, Nietzsche referred to his earlier work, both of tragedy, as smelling offensively Hegelian. An idea, the Dionysian-Apollonian opposition, is translated into metaphysics. In tragedy, the opposition is sublated to become a unity. Now, despite this negative evaluation, the earlier work's opposition between the two Greek gods is anything but schematic. They do not interact as two types on the same level, but rather as two forces of differing nature. And these natures are such as to thoroughly muddy the issue of which force ends up with the upper hand. In Nietzsche's words, Dionysus speaks the language of Apollo, but Apollo finally speaks the language of Dionysus. This is to say that the nature of Dionysus is to be hidden and withdrawn. By letting Apollo take centre stage, is he not the ultimate winner? But then again, insofar as Apollo accomplishes his own nature of dominating the foreground, imposing the mask of serenity, is it not he who wins out? There's no solution to this conundrum. But Kaufman's reading of Nietzsche does allow us to sharpen our understanding of each of the parties involved, as well as their interaction. Again, the abundance of metaphor is a path clearly followed by the author, and competing or mixed metaphors serve to heighten one another. In short, through Kaufman's reading of Nietzsche, she highlights how various familial metaphors figure the relationship of strife between Dionysus and Apollo. The first is that of man and woman, with which the birth of tragedy opens. Art, this is Nietzsche, art derives its continuous development from the duality of the Apolline and the Dionysiac, just as the reproduction of species depends on the duality of the sexes. Elsewhere, Kofman highlights that it is as warring brothers that Nietzsche characterises the pair, an eternal struggle between two irreconcilable rival brothers, who understand one another on the basis of Heraclitean polemos rather than Hegelian dialectic. But perhaps the richest of Nietzsche's metaphorical fields, and certainly the one on which Kofman spends the most time, is that unexpectedly establishing Dionysus as the parent of Apollo. At certain moments, this parent is ambivalently or alternatively identified as both mother and father. Quote, "It is as if Nietzsche conceived at first of Dionysus not as the elder brother of Apollo, but as his mother or father." And then again, in The Birth of Tragedy, there is a metaphysical reasoning of Dionysus which tends to make this god into the father and mother of all things, into the non-disguised voice, the true voice of nature. However, there seems to be more conceptual depth to be found when the mother takes the upper hand in serving to describe Dionysus. Speaking unusually of specific tragedies, Kofman writes, "There is no better example of the pharmaceutical power of tragedy than Sophocles' two tragedies, Oedipus Rex and Oedipus Colonos. The Oedipus character who blinds himself, having dared to gaze into the horrible depths of nature, states abyssally the pharmaceutical power of blinding, which is the very essence of the tragic. The blinding of Oedipus is a preventative measure which protects him against crueler punishment, threatening the impious gaze that dared to scrutinize the depths of Mother Nature." Sophocles' tragedies are thus presented as an interaction between a blindness with pharmaceutical effects, a happy lie, and an intolerable seeing, a deep truth. That truth is the brutality of human instincts, their indifference to the cultural constructs they repeatedly destroy. This is perhaps the sense in which to understand the language of horror and terror that is used here. Nature is not necessarily thus in itself, but it is thus for us, with our pretensions to be socialized and civilized beings. In any case, although the names of Dionysus and Apollo are not used here, it's clear that Kaufman has them in mind, and a slightly earlier passage confirms this. In the same way that he who looks directly at the sun turns away from it, but still has dark marks in front of his eyes, a natural defence against bedazzlement. Thus does he who has dared to gaze upon the horrifying depths of nature, the terrifying mother, produce a defence which is just as natural and necessary as the preceding one, Apollonian light. There therefore seems to be a preference for the mother over the father in terms of identifying the Dionysian. We might recall Nietzsche's dictum, quoted just now, "As my father I have already died, as my mother I am still alive and growing old." Understood in these terms, the father would represent fixity and form, the mother movement and force. But if such distinctions have any use, it is to help us understand Nietzsche and Kaufman's treatment of one of philosophy's major distinctions between nature and culture, of physis and technique. Already we've seen the mother being identified with nature in the composite phrase that we've become too familiar with, perhaps, to properly hear it, Mother Nature, or Mother Nature, the nature of being mother. Thus, while it would be completely legitimate to compare Kaufman's writing on this point with the work on Freud, particularly The Enigma of Women, our main interest lies in the way this debate also opens out onto philosophical approaches to nature, physis, or the way things are. This will allow the concept of comedy to be brought in alongside tragedy in a reworking of the way Apollo features uneasily beside Dionysus, just as it will allow Kaufman to pass Nietzsche's work on Stoicism. So, third and final section, tragedy and comedy. In reading Kaufman, reading Nietzsche, to speak of Dionysus is to speak of motherhood, and ultimately nature, or physis, while being reminded of the unavailability of such topics in a language dominated by Apollo. We might say that there is something like a portmanteau concept of Mother Nature, a nature that always precedes us, generates and nourishes us, as well as remaining unsettlingly out ahead of our understanding. But although Greek tragedy is clearly the context for Nietzsche's discussion, the concept of tragedy does not take us as far as we need to go in thinking about these issues. This is to say that in confronting Mother Nature, might comedy not be a better, or at least a complementary, companion? That much, at least, is what is suggested in 3 areas of Kaufman's writing. First is another chapter in Nietzsche and the philosophical stage, the comedy of Stoicism. Here she acknowledges the way in which comedy takes up the baton from tragedy whilst retaining a dismissive attitude towards that comedy. We're still at Dionysus and Apollo. Apolline comedy represses the intolerable in order to create beautiful surface effects. In her words in the chapter Abstract or Summary, the most tyrannical will to power there is, philosophy imposes on Dionysian measurelessness, its own Apollonian measures. In its wish to be the first cause, to be God, it creates a reassuring world, one in its image, a sort of colossal double that protects them against the violence of becoming, suffering, and death. In this sense, all philosophy is tragic. But it hides this fact away by acting out a comedy, the comedy of morality. Behind its mask, it hypocritically hides its affinity with tragedy. It claims that it is only obeying laws, those of nature or God, rather than trying to be God itself. According to this thinking, comedy would be a conservative force, only seeing its remit and affirming what is, and the current forms of that existence. This is to be contrasted with the more properly philosophical and political ambitions of tragedy, however thwarted they may be. These ambitions are those referred to in Sartre's comment that tragedy prepares the way for a thinking of justice, because it codifies the cruel injustices of nature, fate, and the gods. In any case, Kofman goes on to quote Nietzsche as he dismantles Stoicism's claim to live according to the laws of nature. Stoicism, in fact, imposes its own partial view of such laws in a reasonable, limited, and comforting way. It is unable to appreciate natural processes in their sheer abundance, indifference, or contradictory quality. Nature is said to be prodigious without measure, indifferent without measure, without intention and without concern, with neither pity nor justice, at once fecund and sterile, without determination. And that's Nietzsche being quoted. There thus seems to be little to recommend stoical attitudes or the Apolline comedy with which they are aligned here. But things are slightly different in another text, The Childhood of Art. At its conclusion, we find a section entitled La vie comme jeu, life as game, life as play, life as act, amongst other translations. Here Kaufman brings her thinking of symbolic fatherhood as a function of art to bear on debates around necessity and freedom. Once the myth of the particular artist or genius is debunked, one needs some alternative explanation for the strange way in which art comes to presence. A broader symbolic authority comes into play, but one so broad and neutral as to be quite radical. Thus Kaufman writes of artistic creation with no less a term than necessity, which she capitalizes. Shortly afterwards she expands on the thought, quote, "It's therefore life itself that is the artist." And Freud proposes to replace idolatry of the artist as a great man, aligned with the idolatry of the father, meaning God, respect for nature. The enigma of art is that of life as the artist. To respect nature is not to replace one idol with another, it is to recognize necessity and to submit to its laws. It is to accept reality, death, originary difference, and femininity insofar as the latter symbolizes this difference. As before in terms of motherhood, here it is femininity that, for Freud, is said to represent this necessity, this nature, this way that things are. But whereas in the text on Nietzsche, accepting nature for what it is shown to be a construction or a mythology, here it's presented in a more positive light. In addition, comedy is specifically mentioned by Kofman. She writes, Freudian interpretation of art takes us from conceiving of the world as divine, dictated by finality, to a world of chance and necessity, from childhood which takes le jeu, play, seriously, which engages in the play of seriousness, which is to say the innocence of life. It takes us from tragedy to comedy and humour. It takes us to comedy because Freud's method of demystification is a method that unmasks, and when the masks fall away, the only thing left is to laugh. Now laughter is aligned with a renouncing of profundity and seriousness. The search for meaning and freedom carried out by tragic characters and spectators is abandoned. Matters are somewhat complexified by the fact that this is not precisely an acceptance of underlying masks and superficiality, instead the masks fall away. This perhaps suggests that in this early text of 1970, Kaufman has not yet fully unpacked Nietzsche's categories of Dionysus and Apollo. In any case, it's striking that comedy is spoken of in terms of the destabilizing, liberating aspects of laughter, rather than as a conservative gesture. Our third text was published much later, An Unbeatable Deadbeat, Un Battu Imbattable. I thank Jacob for that translation of the text. An Unbeatable Deadbeat of 1990, responding to the 1924 film He Who Gets Slapped, whose protagonist progressively loses his career and his loved ones being slapped at every turn. This is no doubt a negative experience, and on the face of it, the film appears to be a tragedy. However, Kaufman's text details various ways in which something else is made of this experience. This is not an Aufhebung, Relève, or relief. She even explicitly points out that the protagonist, by now reduced to a circus clown, is on his knees, and the woman he loves ne le relève pas. But something happens nonetheless. And we might even say that the non-determined, neutral, stripped-back nature of that something is what is valorized by Kaufman, over and against more lofty philosophical constructions. She discusses this in a passage citing her earlier work on Socratic aporia, with its near untranslatable title. Comment donc s'en sortir? How to survive this double slap? How not to feel the world crumbling away and the earth ceasing to turn? New paragraph. And yet, it will continue turning. He himself, this is the protagonist who's named he only by this stage, symbolically will turn the globe every evening in a derisory way, dressed as a clown. He will indeed stop crying, to laugh with everyone else at himself, a poor clown, but also at the entire world, this clown's act. He will become capable, in effect, of converting the tragic into the comic. The world keeps turning, which is to say that even if the clown's existence is suffering, it continues to be in an absolute sense. This is how the quasi-alchemistic conversion of tragic into comic takes place. There is also a reference here to the details of the film, with a man become clown presenting various theses to the audience in imitation, remembrance, and parodic relève of his previous academic career. After each thesis, he is slapped. But in one of the later scenes in the film, those laughing at him are also clowns. There is some element of revenge, Kaufman's word, or conversion, also her word, in this. She writes that these other clowns, who, sitting in a circle around him, think, for the duration of the show, this is the pleasure they came for, that they are better than this clown who is beaten to death. They also think they will escape the blows, the derision, and death. So, although he is excluded from the group and notionally at a disadvantage relative to them, in fact a conversion takes place here. He is suffering and will die, but they will die too. The difference is that he knows it. His experience gives him an advantage, a privileged understanding of the way things are, of nature, or physis, or mother nature. Finally, the clown's story of alienation from tutelary figures is referred to in explicitly tragic terms, only for Kaufman to abandon them. The clown's Oedipus complex is therefore not ultimately tragic, but a comic one, allowing his mother and father, and with them humanity, its enigmas and its values, to take a turn for the worse. For what does truth matter? Whether the earth is round or flat, it is a derisory globe which, no matter what, continues to turn, even if you yourself are no longer turning over nicely. And if you want to avoid sinking into the tragic or melancholy, the only contribution you can make is to make it turn for the worse. To mock with unstoppable laughter the seriousness of taking seriously an absurd globe with no place for anyone interested in anything except money. It's notable that where above we saw both tragedy and philosophy functioning in a similarly cathartic way, here they are abandoned together. In ceasing to be Oedipus, the clown ceases to seek to solve the riddle of the Sphinx. What does truth matter? The attitude he adopts seems to be the only one possible if he is to survive, if he is not to mind constantly reliving the trauma of being slapped in his new role as a clown, impersonating and mocking his previous academic career. One thinks of Nietzsche's Eternal Return or Camus' Sisyphus. But, and this is my final point, a troubling aspect remains to Kaufman's conclusion. It's exemplified by, but not limited to, the notion that on this absurd earth there is, quote, no place for anyone interested in anything except money. This is coupled with the injunction to abandon the metaphysical search for truth and to follow the indifferent abundance of life itself while ignoring more local or particular claims of justice. Whilst these ideas had their own specific lineage and meaning in Kaufman's intellectual itinerary and context, is it not possible that they have quite another today? Abandoning claims to truth, embracing the superficial, accepting the way things are, praising life itself to the exclusion of anything more localized. Are these not conservative thoughts? It's far from certain whether the grounds to push back against this are firm ones. We could respond to the critique by stating that nature for Kaufman is never fixed. That was the mistake of Stoicism. It is always both more threatening and more vulnerable than we think. Perhaps we should not speak of nature for Kaufman, but always of Mother Nature. That is something surely too big for conservatism to think. Perhaps it's also too big for we others to think too, but that does not mean we should not attempt to do so. We'll get started for the next session. Yeah, sure. Yeah, cool. So we've got two speakers. First of Large, Professor of European Literature at University of East Anglia. He's published lots of works on Nietzsche. He edits the complete works of Nietzsche in Schrift. He's translated Kaufman's Nietzsche metaphor, which I was quoting earlier, those were Duncan's words that came into my paper. I know less about your relationship with Kaufman. I know that you knew her.
I'll be saying some things about that, yeah.
Sure. So, very much pleased to have you here.
Thank you, John. And let me begin by saying how delighted I am that you and Jacob have organised this event and been minded to mark the quarter century since Sarah's passing, and how honoured I am to have been invited to contribute. I think the only previous Kaufman conference in the UK was the one Keith Lansell Pearson organised in 95. Have there been others in between that I've missed? I know there was one there have been others outside the UK, of course, and the Chicago conference in 2001. Keith Lansell Pearson organised an event in 95 which was to have featured Kaufman herself, of course, tragedy was not able to. So it's been all too long since then, and it's wonderful that we can gather today. For my contribution this afternoon, I didn't want to speak on Kaufman and Nietzsche because I've done that a few times in the past, and what's more, I suspected that there would be others who would want to do that. So instead, I've chosen to focus on one of Kaufman's rather less well-known books, her extended essay on Freud's reading of Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice. It was published in French in 1987 as a small book, So it's only 80 pages in French, 70 pages in French. Conversion, le marchand de Venise, sous le signe de Saturne. Came out in English translation 1990, translated by Sean Whiteside, as a 25-page essay, Conversions, The Merchant of Venice Under the Sign of Saturn, in a CUP collection, Literary Theory Today. So a lot of water has flowed under the bridge in 25 years, of course. I hosted Sarah's last trip to the UK in spring 1994. It was the 150th anniversary conference of the Friedrich Nietzsche Society, when I also first met Tracy. And I was a young Nietzsche scholar at the time, fairly recently arrived in the Department of German at Swansea University in South Wales. So my own trajectory since then has brought me, well, 5 years ago to the University of East Anglia in Norwich, and I'm now based there in the School of Literature, Drama and Creative Writing, running the British Centre for Literary Translation. Since my first book publication was my translation of Kofman's Nietzsche and Metaphor, which has been referred to in '93, I like to think that Kaufman was intimately implicated in my move into translation studies, my most recent career move. At any rate, it's certainly the case that being in a different institutional context reflects an evolution in my own research, a turn towards translation studies. And as a result, when I read Kaufman's work now, I approach it rather differently and find different themes interesting, different texts important. So, hence my focus this afternoon on conversion, which I've increasingly found myself being drawn to, and which has emerged for me as, I think it's cliche, but an unjustly neglected text. I first came across the text when I was researching the Kaufman bibliography that I included in my translation of Nietzsche and Metaphor, and I bought a copy from Gibert in Paris on the day I first met Sarah in December '92. When I first read it shortly afterwards, I can tell from my marginal notes, and isn't that always fascinating to revisit the traces of your previous readings? I can tell from my marginal notes that I was particularly struck by her wonderfully insightful style of close reading, Freud and Shakespeare, and in particular her signature mode of reading Freud with Nietzsche. At that stage I was already reading Kaufman with the eye of the translator. I was in the process of translating Nietzsche and Metaphor, but I now read the text, all her texts, with the eye of a translation studies scholar as well. Kaufman herself took a keen interest in translations of her work and was very supportive of her translators. She didn't write much directly on translation, but Conversion, with its concern for all kinds of transformation, is the nearest thing, I think, to a treatise on the subject. Given that translations are another kind of conversion, in my conclusion, I'll turn to the question of what a Kaufmanian theory of translation might look like. Before we get there, though, I want to take you through the various layers of my response to the text and consider a number of different contexts for its interpretation. Specifically, I want to consider Conversion, firstly, as a response on Kaufman's part to a literary text. It's her only text, in fact, that focuses on Shakespeare. And consider the light it sheds on some methodological questions pertaining to the relation between philosophy, psychoanalysis, and literature in her work. For it's not just a reading of a literary text, of course, but a reading of a reading by Freud, set off, as I shall argue, by a third interlocutor, Nietzsche. After setting out Freud's take on Merchant of Venice then, and Kaufman's response to it, I want to focus on her methodology and the crucial role played in Conversion by the concept of ambivalence. I'll read this text as consonant with Kaufman's career-long concern for tropes and metaphors, for transformations, metamorphoses, at the most basic level, how one thing turns into another, and argue that her ultimately intense deconstructive interest in ambivalence is in the interest of getting beyond the binary logic of conversion that she sees at work all too often in Freud. So I think the book is actually a critique of the notion of conversion, and I'll say more about that in due course. Beyond these initial frames of reference, though, in the latter half of my talk, I want to develop some other parts of interpretation which take the conversion theme as their point of departure. I'll bring out three kinds of conversion which seem to me to be neglected by Kaufman herself, and in true Kaufmanian fashion, subject these absences and aporias to my own symptomatic readings. I want to read the text then as an aspect of Kaufman's increasing interest in Judaism in the 1980s, and in coming to terms with her own Jewishness. One of the conversions which Kaufman thematizes is Shylock's forced conversion from Judaism to Christianity at the end of Act 4 of Shakespeare's play. But I want to focus on the other religious conversion in the play which Kaufman neglects, namely the unforced, willed conversion of Shylock's daughter, Jessica. That will inevitably bring me on to examining some of the autobiographical elements which we can, and indeed are invited to, interpret après coup in the light of her late autobiographical text, Rue ordinaire, rue là-bas, specifically her own conversion to Christianity during the war. Finally, I'll focus on the theme of cross-dressing in the text, gender bending, which Kaufman leaves surprisingly uncommented, given where the text comes in her oeuvre. Okay, first section, la relève de la philosophie. So I'll start my analysis with a methodological reflection, putting some linguistic pressure on the conference's subtitle, The Relief of Philosophy. It was already explained earlier on that one of the senses of that is the French relève. And for me, I think relève de la philosophie describes quite well Kaufman's attitude towards philosophy. Relève, the sublation of philosophy. For Kaufman, philosophy is always destined to be sublated by literature and psychoanalysis, and vice versa. She holds these disciplines in suspension, they mutually supplement each other. One could even go so far as to say, ça relève de la philosophie. It's in the nature of philosophy to be sublated. It's this approach which, in my view, makes for the marvellous richness of Kaufman's readings, advocating and demonstrating that the literary text has a truth of its own, which is every bit as vital and urgent as the philosophical and psychoanalytic truths which it preempts. This, after all, is only what Freud himself maintained in his 1922 letter to the great Viennese dramatist Arthur Schnitzler on the occasion of the latter's 60th birthday in 1922. For all these quotes, I've given the German and French plus translation, so I know we have a multilingual audience. I'll read the original sentence. So habe ich den Eindruck gewonnen, dass sie durch Intuition, eigentlich aber infolge feiner Selbstwahrnehmung, alles das wissen, was ich in mühseliger Arbeit an anderen Menschen aufgedeckt habe. So Freud complimenting Schnitzer on having, through his dramatic works, effectively preempted the findings of psychoanalysis. Kaufman was writing on the intimate nexus between literature and philosophy right from her earliest publication, a 1963 article on Sartre. Throughout her career, she chose to work on literary philosophers and on philosophical literary writers, always scrupulous not to maintain a strict separation between the two categories. In her early publications of the 1970s, she follows Freud's literary tastes in reading Freud's literary readings, the series of 4 essays which will become Quatre romans analytiques of 74. And Conversion is clearly a pendant to that project, even if, as it happens, it was published in English after Sarah Wick's translation of Freud and Fiction. So the chronology is actually reversed. In French, Quatre romans analytiques comes out 13 years before Conversion in English. The translation of Conversion comes out actually before the translation of Freud and Fiction. Kaufman hadn't written on Shakespeare before this text, and indeed wouldn't afterwards either. Her interest is in Freud's reading, not so much in the Shakespeare itself. Kofman's essay is a reading of Freud's short piece Das Motiv der Kästchenwahl from 1913. The literal translation would be the motif of choosing caskets. The standard edition translation, the theme of the three caskets. Here, Freud opens with a discussion of The Merchant of Venice and rapidly establishes a parallel with a second Shakespeare play, King Lear. One of the important subplots of The Merchant has Portia's suitors choosing between three caskets. And once the caskets have been translated by Freud into three women, that's the beginning of his interpretation, this episode is paralleled with Lear choosing between his three daughters. And Freud admitted in a letter of 1913 to Ferenczi that his essay was mainly motivated by his having three daughters of his own. So there's quite a personal investment in the subject on his part. So choosing three women, between three women, in each case the least showy, the most mute, apparently the least valuable of the options is actually of the greatest value. So in The Merchant, it is the lead casket that contains the portrait of Portia, indicating a successful choice and her hand in marriage. In Lear, it is Cordelia whose mute love for Lear appears least, but in fact is most fiercely sustained. Freud marshals a number of further examples from myth and fairy tale, where a male character chooses between three women, the Judgment of Paris, Cinderella, and some other examples. He isolates a common characteristic of muteness and argues that the muteness of the chosen one indicates by impeccable dream logic that she, in fact, symbolizes death. And the fact that the process is represented as an act of choice rather than a necessity indicates for Freud a wish fulfillment, as again in a dream. Such scenarios figure the desire to control one's own destiny. And for Freud, the ultimate three women are indeed the fates. As Kaufman points out then, Freud reads these literary works as if they were dreams. In other words, his interpretation uses the binary logic of substitution and inversion. The key terms in Freud's German text are Ersetzung and Umkehrung, so substitution and inversion. These are the main kind of operators for Freud's interpretation. Freudian dream logic is a logic of transformations, whereby one thing turns into another, its opposite. One thing can be translated into another in an interpretation which unfolds according to a principle of one-to-one equivalence. Thus, in Shakespeare's text on Freud's reading, according to Kaufman, the first substitution is the claim that the three caskets stand for three women. But Freud, in fact, makes a chain of substitutions, of which this is only the first. The lead casket signifies the pale, mute woman, who in turn signifies death. But at this point, Kaufman points to an important and under-recognized feature of Freud's analysis. There is a point in Freud's narrative where the binary dream logic of inversion and substitution broadens into something else, where he moves away from dream interpretation in favor of a recognition of ambivalence, precisely what he terms eine alte Ambivalenz, an old ambivalence of meaning. He draws on the real relation, as he calls it, between love and death as two sides of the same coin. So it's not that one turns into the other, he argues, but that both are available, both senses are available at the same time. Freud points to the historic identity between different guises of Aphrodite. The goddess of love is also the bringer of death. So in this case, the process of conversion is incomplete, because the one has not been transformed into the other wholly and without residue. Instead of a straight Ersetzung durch das Gegenteil, replacement by the opposite origin remains, at least in trace form, and gives itself away to the trained hermeneut who knows where to look. So this is Freud talking about the ambivalence of the goddess of love as the goddess of death. Bei näherem Zusehen merken wir freilich, dass die Entstellungen des ursprünglichen Mythos nicht gründlich genug sind, um sich nicht durch Resterscheinungen zu verraten. So it's not a completed conversion. There are what he calls Resterscheinungen. There are these traces. Although Kofman doesn't establish the parallel, this is actually a Nietzschean gesture. Just as Freud is interested in the alchemical process of dream and myth interpretation, of literary symbolism, whereby something stands for and needs to be interpreted as its opposite, so Nietzsche is also drawn to the alchemical, to the conversion of base metal into gold in the context of values. He opens the 1878 text Human or to Human with a chemistry of concepts and sensations, arguing, die historische Philosophie dagegen ermittelte, dass es keine Gegensätze sind. There are no opposites. Nach ihrer Erklärung gibt es streng gefasst weder ein unegoistisches Handeln noch ein völlig interesseloses Anschauen. Es sind beides nur Sublimierungen, sublimations, this chemical and alchemical vocabulary that he's using here, bei denen das Grundelement fast verflüchtigt erscheint und nur noch für die feinste Beobachtung sich als vorhanden erweist. Traces of the origin which otherwise have been occluded. Kaufman explicitly criticizes Freud then for a failure to see the importance of this kind of ambivalence in Shakespeare's text, and she names it l'erreur de Freud, so Freud's error. He's led astray, she claims, by the dream logic of inversion to focus exclusively on the lead casket, which he wants to ally with the goddess of death, and to ignore the lesson of the ambivalence of all the metals. So this is Kaufman's rebuff to Freud's interpretation. Ainsi l'or, l'argent, le plomb sont tous trois ambivalents d'une ambivalence dissimulée par le clivage en trois métaux différents, voire opposés, qui camouflent leur profonde parenté, leur dérivation commune de celui qui est supposé le plus vil, le plomb ou Saturne, clivage qui occulte que chacun d'eux, et pas seulement le plomb, porte inscrit en lui le temps, le risque de transformation, de détérioration, de transmutation dans un sens ou dans l'autre, et cache sous des dehors dorés et argentés la genèse, le devenir, la mort. It's a wonderful sentence. I got a bit, but I mean, one gets a sense of the fantastic stylistic achievement of Kaufman's prose. Anyway. The English, yes, I picked up on the English, the final line of the English translation there. Sean Whiteside's English translation of what Kaufman calls le devenir. He translated it as development rather than becoming. It seems to me that rather conceals the Nietzschean coordinates of Kaufman's analysis. Elsewhere, she will explicitly refer to Shylock's volonté de puissance, for example, his will to power. In Conversion, Kaufman applies a Nietzsche-derived corrective to Freud, and ironically, her English translator, Sean Whiteside, would go on to translate Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy for Penguin Classics 3 years later. For Kaufman's hermeneutics, then, the category of ambivalence is crucial and supersedes the various conversions on which Freud concentrates. Conversion is usually associated with a Damascene moment of anagnorisis, of recognition, and peripeteia, a sudden reversal of fortune, of the kind that befalls Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, Antonio, no less than twice in the course of the play. Conversion is often associated with a violence. The developing situation reaches a tipping point and then switches in a catastrophic event. In the, on the back cover of the French edition of Conversion, Kaufman glosses the term conversion as precisely a renversement catastrophique, so a catastrophic overturning. In the process of conversion, one thing becomes another, stands for the other, takes its place, entirely occludes it. But the message of ambivalence is that no successful complete conversion is possible. The two obey differing logics. On the one hand, Freud's binary logic of either or, on the other, Kofman's deconstructive post-binary logic of both and. In turn, Kofman herself proceeds to generalize the category of ambivalence and apply it to the rest of the play's themes. In a chapter, Pour une ambivalence généralisée, towards a generalized ambivalence, that takes up half of her text. Such a generalized theory of ambivalence is characterized by situations where two mutually opposing meanings exist simultaneously, one always poised to turn into the other on the stroke of an interpretation. Conversion is an activity. Ambivalence is a state awaiting an interpretation. The argument reaches its culmination in Kofman's analysis in her characterization of what she calls the structural ambivalence of time itself, l'ambivalence structurelle du temps. Avec et par le temps foncièrement ambivalent, toutes les conversions restent possibles. This is what she calls the thème véritable de ce drame baroque, the true theme of this baroque drama, Shakespeare's. Now, it's not the first time that Kofman has made this notion of ambivalence work so hard. It's crucial to her reading of Freud's text on Kofman, too. Incarnated in the recurring figure of the Janus face, it's an important feature of her analysis of Freud's jokes, Pourquoi rit-on, of Nietzsche's autobiography, Ecce Homo, and so on. In the conclusion to Conversion, her claim is that the generalization of ambivalence disqualifies Freud's overly simplistic readings of literature based on dream interpretations, which in turn hinge on one-for-one decipherings. Kofman is presenting an alternative hermeneutics. She's correcting Freud's error, not only in his reading of this play, but his reading of fiction more generally. One might say that Kofman converts conversion into ambivalence, and she argues that Freud missed the trick by not doing so himself. At this point, though, I think one is entitled to feel slightly puzzled by the title of Kofman's book. Specifically, if ambivalence sublates conversion as an interpretative category, why does the book highlight the term to such an extent? After all, The Merchant of Venice is described by Kofman as a drame de la conversion sous toutes ses formes, a drama of conversion in all its forms. We need to bear in mind then that the word conversion is Kofman's word, not Freud's. She's chosen a particularly Polysemous word to summarize all the different kinds of transformation that she's interested in Shakespeare's play and Freud's reading of it. The German translation of her text is titled Konversionen, but that's not a term that Freud himself uses in his essay. The dictionary offers many other possible German terms for conversion, most of which are formed with the prefix Umrechnung, Umsetzung, Umdeutung, Umformung, and so on. But Freud doesn't use any of these in his essay on the Merchant of Venice either. Nor indeed does Freud use the more standard word for religious conversion in German, Bekehrung. That's the term used by the standard German translated edition of Shakespeare's play, translated by August Wilhelm von Schlegel. There's only one point in Shakespeare's text when religious conversion is explicitly mentioned. This is Shylock's daughter Jessica in Act 3, Scene 5. Nay, you need not fear as Lorenzo, and so on, for in converting Jews to Christians you raise the price of pork. This is the only point in Shakespeare's play where he makes reference to religious conversion using the term, and Schlegel uses the standard German word for it, which is bekehrt. So that's the standard German word for religious conversion, but again, Freud doesn't use that term either in his essay. So by highlighting conversion in her title and using a word, conversion, which allows more easily than in German, I think, to establish a parallel between religious conversions and other kinds, Kaufman draws greater attention than otherwise, it seems to me, to precisely the religious connotation of conversion. And this in turn marks a new direction in Kaufman's writings of the 80s and 90s, coming to terms with Judaism and the Holocaust. The other main text, which she published in the same year as Conversion, was precisely her first main text on a Jewish theme, Paroles suffoquées. Now, Kaufman supplements Freud's interpretation of Shakespeare's text by pointing out that, as she puts it again on the back cover, ce livre montre que la conversion du juif est seulement un cas particulier d'une convertibilité générale et réciproque des personnages Antonio, Bassanio, Shylock et de métaux qui figurent, le plomb, l'or, l'argent. So for Kaufman then, yes, conversion in the religious sense is, as she calls it, un cas particulier, a particular sense of conversion, but she wants to generalize. She wants to apply the term to many other aspects of the play. I want to bring Kaufman back to the religious theme and focus in particular, in a way that she does not herself, not on the forced conversion of Shylock, but on the conversion of his daughter Jessica in the play. In Conversion, Kaufman focuses on Shylock's conversion exclusively and fails to thematize his daughter Jessica, who is also converted. But there are important differences between the fates of the two. Shylock is forcibly converted towards the end of the play as punishment for insisting on his bond. Jessica, on the other hand, willingly agrees to convert and abjure her Judaism through marriage to the Christian Lorenzo. Jessica is converted through marriage, but as the critic Ozar Holmer points out, Shakespeare presumably, he invents the name Jessica, that's a name that Shakespeare invents, and Ozar Holmer points out that it has an allusion to the biblical figure of Jesse, precisely in order to invoke a biblical figure who is a willing convert to Christianity. So there's something about Jessica's very name that marks her out as a willing convert. She elopes with Lorenzo, taking with her a large cache of her father's jewels. In this respect, the play is a tale of multiple faithlessness. I want to argue then that Kaufman's omission of Jessica is a blind spot that betrays an anxiety stemming from an uneasy identification with Shakespeare's character. After all, I think the play has a real connection, personal connection for her, if we bear in mind that Freud cites the title in its standard German form, Der Kaufmann von Venedig. Kaufmann is the daughter of a Kaufmann, the Rabbi Berek Kofman. Of course, the Merchant of Venice is not Shylock, it's Antonio, but I think still one can argue that Kaufman has a significant personal investment in her analysis of Freud's reading of the play. And I'd like now to read it briefly in the context of Rue Ordinaire, Rue Labarthe, the culmination of that autobiographical strain in writing. Rue Ordinaire, Rue Labarthe is the text that reveals that for Kaufman there is a very personal relation to conversion in the religious sense, because during the war she abandoned her Judaism and converted to Christianity herself. So I'm suggesting that perhaps there's an anxiety on her part surrounding a possible identification with Jessica, precisely in Shakespeare's play. At the opening of Rue Ordinaire, Kaufman invites us to read her earlier works in the light of it. So that's what I'll briefly now do. Mes nombreux livres ont peut-être été des voies de traverse obligées pour parvenir à raconter ça. Now, Kaufman's father acts as a kind of patron for this text. He's invoked right at the outset in the form of his own fountain pen, as we've heard. And we're told then that the fountain pen constrains her to write. The fountain pen is the instantiation of, if you like, the law of the father. We've seen that Kaufman has no compunction about criticizing her mentor, Freud, setting him straight in her analysis of his reading of Shakespeare, but the memory of her actual father, murdered in Auschwitz, is steadfastly and faithfully cultivated. Things are very different with her mother, of course. and the main narrative in Rue Ordinaire Rue Là-Bas concerns how she turned against her birth mother in favour of her adoptive mother Mémé in wartime Paris. She relates how she begins to eat pork and forgets her Yiddish. She's baptized and passes as Mémé's daughter, willingly taking on the name Suzanne. She internalizes Mémé's anti-Semitism and begins to hate her own Jewishness. In her repudiation of Judaism, Suzanne resembles Shakespeare's Jessica, the willing convert. And yet, her attitude to her two mothers is agonal, ambivalent, and defies Jessica's binary logic. I agree then here with Joanne Faulkner's analysis of Kaufman's text when she writes of arguing that Kaufman's objection of Judaism in Rue Ordinaire Rue Là-Bas is crucial to the construction of her Jewish identity in the context of the Nazi occupation, that at the heart of all identification is ambivalence. This is Joanne Faulkner on Rue Ordinaire. So, how are we doing for time?
You're approaching the end.
Yeah, okay. I've got a paragraph on the cross-dressing. I'm not sure exactly, I'd welcome your thoughts on this, but this seems to be another area that Kaufman really underplays in her interpretation of the play and of Freud's reading of it. Namely, the female characters. This Conversion postdates Kaufman's main groundbreaking work of feminist criticism, but as I say, the female characters are strangely under-addressed, it seems to me. The theme of the Saturnalia has been addressed by Kaufman at various points in her earlier career, and the Saturnalia of gender in Shakespeare's play is an important element on which recent criticism has certainly picked up. Of course, female characters were played by male actors in the first place, but the gender bending is compounded by further cross-dressing. There are two main examples in The Merchant of Venice. In Act 2, Scene 6, Jessica is, quote, transformed to a boy in order to escape her father's supervision. And then in Act 4, Scene 1, Nerissa and Portia turn to men and cross-dress to become lawyers for the court scene. In the context of my analysis, what's perhaps most important is that in neither case is the conversion permanent. It's rather a reversible oscillation, perhaps. In Act 5, Scene 1, Nerissa and Portia can convert back again to give back their rings. As Ozark Holmer points out, though, to quote her again, the transformation can never be entirely undone because these names, Jessica, Portia, Nerissa, these are all names that are feminine conversions of masculine names. I think that's a really interesting point. In other words, although they might be able to take off their men's clothes, they can't do that quite so easily with their names. And this suggests for me then, along the lines that I've been arguing so far, the model of ambivalence being preferred to conversion once again. Concluding then, we've seen how ambivalence is pitted by Kaufman against conversion in her analysis, but I've taken a number of additional senses, I think, which go beyond Kaufman's reading of Shakespeare's play and Freud's interpretation of it. I want to return, though, now to that question I opened at the beginning of translation and ask what might be the implications of a general theory of ambivalence that Kaufman sets out in the context of the conversion that is translation. This is, I think, the most substantial comment that Kaufman makes on translation. This is Comment s'en sortir, when she's writing of the ambiguities of the word poros in relation to translating it. Traduire, s'ouvrir un chemin dans une langue en utilisant ses ressources décidées pour un sens, c'est sortir des impasses angoissantes, aporétiques de toute traduction. C'est accomplir le geste philosophique par excellence, un geste de trahison. Reconnaître l'intraductibilité de Poros et d'Aporia, c'est indiquer qu'il y a dans ces termes que Platon reprend à toute une tradition de quoi rompre avec une conception philosophique de la traduction et avec la logique de l'identité qu'elle implique. Traditional translation for Kofman is a betrayal then She's drawing on the traditional Italian characterization of the traduttore as traditore. The translator is faced with an array of choices and usually needs to plump for one or the other. In the case of highly polysemous terms like poros and apoia, it's obvious that limiting the range of signification promotes loss and amounts to a betrayal. But in fact, this is the case to a greater or lesser extent in all acts of translation. The alternative is to embrace at least a degree of untranslatability in every translation, to hold open ambiguity, to prize ambivalence. Most publishers would not look kindly on a translator who submitted final copy offering a wealth of unresolved alternatives, but it ought at least to be possible to treat the untranslatable as a kind of regulatory idea. This is the position of studied ambivalence adopted by Barbara Cassin for her monumental project, The Dictionary of Untranslatables. And I'll leave you with this quotation, which comes from her introduction and gives the watchword for her take on what it means to translate the untranslatable. L'intraduisible, c'est plutôt ce qu'on ne cesse pas de, and then in parentheses, ne pas traduire. De traduire, de ne pas traduire, that ambivalence that she encases in the parentheses, I think, for me, speaks to Kaufman's preoccupations as well. And I'll leave it there, thank you. So our third and final speaker of this session is noted, of course, already as one of the co-organizers of our event, Jacob Batesford. Jacob's a writer with a particular interest in autobiographical and post-autobiographical literature, and he works as an assistant at the Library and Archives of the British Psychoanalytical Society, and he's also a current MSc student in the psychoanalysis unit in London. So, is your title still the same?
Yeah.
So, two late career references to Galileo.
Yeah. The title is not kind of really fulfilled in the way it's going to be, but we're still going to do the same material. It's a tiny bit reductive, and it moves in quite kind of an exploratory or delirious way that I think. Let's put it together. Okay. Towards the end of the oeuvre, two relatively heterogeneous texts each seem to take up and to modify a phrase apocryphally attributed to Galileo. And yet it moves, an affirmation of the truth of a heliocentric Copernican model of the universe, in the face of persecution by forces of infamy, a Catholic Church, the geocentric doctrine of which it will have contradicted, and the narcissism or omnipotence of which it will, in popular imagination, have assailed. What is the function, or what are the functions, of Kaufman's appropriation of this phrase, which is transformed into, and yet it continues to move, in one of these texts, and into, and yet it quakes, in the other? Are they to be taken as indications of an identification with Galileo? If so, what are the grounds and states of this identification, parodic or otherwise? To what degree does it signify the sentiment of nearness to Galileo, or it upright and impudent by Copernican truth behind him, rejecting the superstitions of his persecutors? To what degree does it signify the sentiment of a distance? Okay. So I don't think so. So my present sense is that while on the one hand these questions are of value and worthy of direct analysis, on the other their suitable response would require the organisation and the negotiation of a relatively large amount of material, which I just don't think I can do in the paper, so I'm going to do things quite different. So as such, instead of you facilitating a movement towards those answers, I would like to substitute in the more easily approachable question of the nature of and relation between the two texts in which these references appear. An Unbeatable Deadbeat, on the one hand, a short analysis of a silent pre-war American film based on a Russian novel, which was first published in 1990, and Yet It Quakes, on the other, a comparative study of Voltaire and Nietzsche, first published in 1994. Each of these texts were published posthumously in 1995 in The Imposture of Beauty. Okay. The study will be organised in the following way, and again, I'm not going to fulfil the whole summary, but I still present. Firstly, departing from material which bears more relevance to An Unbeatable Deadbeat, we will attempt to characterise the bases of Kaufman's critique of tragedy in both humanitarian and philosophical or epistemophilic concerns, and show how each text can be understood such as further elaborations of this critique. Then, in a more comparative vein, we will look at the affirmative aspects of both texts and their relation to attempts by Kaufman to further her conceptualisation of comedy, indicating how the assimilation of these aspects of each text And these aspects of each text furnishes an interesting model of integrative process through which other areas of Kaufman's thought can be read. Finally, we'll return this conceptualization of comedy to questions of the epistemophic, examining the fashion in which each text implies a continuous fidelity to scientific or philosophical process, before closing on an examination of the fashion in which, and yet it quakes, inscribes laughter and gaiety, within psychical economy dominated by a will to truth and to the pushing of critical wit. Okay. In Explosion 2, in the process of detailing the novel conception of tragedy communicated by Nietzsche in The Twilight of the Idols, Kofman states that the same evil eye of Aristotle had constrained him to crafting a philosophy of substance, to believing in identity and the permanence of being, and to conceiving of a cathartic conception of tragedy, before assimilating the process of passing from a philosophy of substance to a philosophy of becoming, to that of breaking with the modification willed by Aristotelian catharsis. I think that it is uncontroversial to say that a critique of tragedy and interest in the fashion in which a classically tragic structure might be transformed or displaced, after being first established as part of Kaufman's conceptual vocabulary in the late 1970s, runs throughout the oeuvre in a consistent and essential fashion. His interest in this critique seemed to me to have two discrete bases, which we'll come to after sketching out the presence of these concerns in the two texts which we're looking at. So in And Yet It Quakes, this critique and these concerns are presented in an implicit fashion and limited to the outset of the text, the first few pages. They're given to view in the interest which Kaufman takes in the effective and philosophical responses of Voltaire and Nietzsche to their witnessing of actual humanitarian disasters, earthquakes in Lisbon and Ischia, and in the derisory scorn which he directs in passing at the anti-Semitic priests of the Inquisition in the former, which, seeking an infallible means for precluding the earth from shaking and for forestalling total ruin after the earthquake, had found such a sole remedy, the offering up on spectacle of some people burnt in a little fire with great ceremony. In An Unbeatable Deadbeat, by contrast, tragedy and its displacement, here into comedy, are treated throughout the text in an explicit notion fashion. These concerns are given to view in the film Analysed, in which a scientist, subject to humiliation before an audience of academics, takes up a career as a clown and repeats that humiliation in a circus act, willfully inserting himself into the role as the object of tragedy, before these spectators which, in witnessing and suffering, and this is a quote again, feel themselves superior to this clown, beaten to death, believing themselves to escape the blows which are due to him through his derision. They are also given to view, or these concerns are also given to view, in questions concerning the effective response of the spectator external to the film, i.e. the author of the review, Kaufman herself, and of a reader, in turn, subject to the film's textual representation. So even from this, the stakes in Kaufman's work of tragedy are quite clear. There is a hostility towards the subjects of tragedy, which economise and always already extant internal ruin, their identity with becoming, through the image of the sufferance or death of others. And, conversely, there is a will to finding a means of economising or negotiating ruin differently, and thus of establishing oneself as a remove from those subjects. The bases of the critique follow on quite directly from these two positions of a subject and object of tragedy, the equivalent two parts played out in an intersubjective process. So the first of these bases, a critique of tragedy on philosophical or epistemic grounds, is derivative of an interpretation of the relief offered by tragedy as the outcome of an essentially avoidant process. It allows for the occultation of truth and the forgetting of such a thing on the part of the spectator. Okay, so these are everyday fears, the Dionysic abyss, a madness, death, or ruin extant within oneself, a final disappropriation, or the death drive. To use the vocabulary of the space of the Caesura, a text in the late 1970s on Lacoue-Labarthe and Michel Deutsch's staging Antigone, or that which life has of the terrible and the horrifying. To use the vocabulary used in Explosion and in Negative Wakes in relation to Nietzsche and in this measure, tragedy is objectionable and in the service of anti-philosophical forces because it facilitates a saying no to life on the part of the subject, a refusal of experience. A question here is what becomes of that avoided thing and why tragedy and associated processes in human life more broadly serve so well to facilitate its avoidance. An interesting answer would be that there's the realization of a process theorized by Melanie Klein known as projective identification, which involves the unconscious fantasy of being able to split off unwanted thoughts, feelings, and aspects of oneself and project them into other people and things. In difference to projection, which is more closely associated with delusion and psychosis, projective identification involves the unconscious manipulation of reality so as to evoke those thoughts, feelings, or aspects in the object which one feels oneself put into. And the spectacle of seeing those feelings performed within an object is then taken as confirmation of the fantasy. So because of this confirmation, the relief procured is generally much greater than in projection appearance. So the second of the bases of Kaufman's critique of tragedy on humanitarian grounds, comes into focus when attention is shifted from the part of the spectator to that object, as it is in Unmutable Deadbeat, building on material first broached in some other words with regard to the relationship of the SS and the dead body. It stems from an understanding of the tragic relief accomplished by the spectator as having the denigration of that object as a structurally necessary counterpart. And with projective identification in mind, we can imagine why that's so. So it's a bit reductive, and obviously the critique of tragedy is much more complex, but we're still kind of working through material. So if the space of the caesura and similar early texts on tragedy speak simply of a structure which guards you, protects you from madness and death, makes you to hold yourself upon your feet, so very upright, so very seated, and to dominate a stage where you find stagings of sufferance and death. On Unbeatable Deadbeat, with intense pathos, elaborates rather the part of the object interior to that tragic structure. In this instance, a disappropriated and dehumanised clown which, reduced to the lowest rank, is only he who gets beaten, an anonym which unleashes and authorises the laughter of the public, comforted thus in their superiority and in their mastery. So these descriptions seem to invite a vision of this clown and in part that it plays, that of a being without a name, the sole right of which is to be beaten, to be thrown to the earth, and at the end of each sitting to dying, with Kaufman's characterisations of the dead body in smothered words. She describes them as transformed by the SS into beings without figure, without an eye, anonymous, disguised in a grotesque fashion, reduced to the worst objection, a collective and anonymous figure of which the role is to labour, to receive blows, and to die from hunger or cold, to be exterminated. So here the camps are also defined at once as a sinister theatre where roles were strictly assigned, and a magnification, a caricature, a pathology of that which happens in the normal real world. In the space of the caesura, Lacoue-Labarthe is characterised by Kaufman as suggesting that we cannot break with a generalised specularisation and disjoin from the cathartic scene, but in constituting still a theatre, but a wholly other theatre, in inventing a wholly other scenic space. This wholly other theatre, as Kaufman locates it in the 70s in Lacoue-Labarthe, involves the constitution rather of a theatre which opens itself onto an abyss, a depth, a chasm, the mise en scene of a loss without recourse of all assured positions, of all aplomb. So if, unlike Lacoue-Labarthe, Kaufman remained more or less exclusively working at the level of textual, essayistic work, didn't produce plays, we can nevertheless see attempts at elaborating this wholly other theatre in the literary experimentation operative, sometimes more explicitly, sometimes more implicitly, of her writings. So we're going to move to the second section of a little bit of material. In An Unbeatable Deadbeat, the comic affirmations taken by the clown, which is presented by Kaufman as facilitating a conversion of the tragic into the comic, so it breaks with that kind of that, it seems to degree, is characterised in the following terms. He bears his humiliation through willing actively that which he would have been due otherwise solely to suffer. He no more simply suffers the blows inflicted upon him, but rather chooses himself to be beaten, which is to say he assumes voluntarily the role which it was always already decided he'd play. He himself, symbolically, on every evening, spins a terrestrial globe in a derisory fashion, dressed as a clown. He sees his cry, indeed, so to laugh at himself, a poor clown, at the earth in its entirety, his clownery. Each evening, in a ludic mode, he repeats the traumatising double scene of his original humiliation. He has been slapped by a benefactor who had appropriated his scientific work, and by a wife who does not relieve him, but rather she too, cynically, slaps and snickers, bringing him to earth, setting him lowlier than earth, leaving him with no escape. So that Kaufman's characterization in the text. In this affirmation of sufferance, presented as a conversion of a passive masochism into an active masochism, the repetitivity of the ludic mode of the clown forms a kind of pendant to Nietzsche's valorization of the acquiescence to life without reserve, the theorization of which is developed so intensively across explosions, which were written in the interim between the two texts that we're looking at. So when that became first, and Kaufman worked on explosion for a few years, and came to it quakes. And yet it quakes, which revisits and restates a great many of the central concerns of that text, of a concise restatement of the logic of that acquiescence, so as to preclude man from forever remaining this sublime abortion bequeathed by the ascetic ideal. One must on the contrary learn to render it more beautiful, stronger, and thus more wretched, more confident in its powers which it will have through until then transferred, voiding itself in this onto the divinity. Since the amorphity of Nietzsche wills the eternal return of life itself in that which has a lot of the terrible and the horrifying, without making these an argument against existence, but wholly on the contrary supplementary reason for affirming it, it signifies that acquiescence to life without reserve. So just summarising. This inducative acquiescence is then positioned in fundamental opposition to the avoidance of the tragic structure detailed above. In this, the differentiation of the clown, abject but ludicrously affirming sufferance and death, from the audience around it, seated but entangled in an avoidant structure, comes more sharply to view. So we're going to go over the Semitism kind of again and again. So I know it's a bit delirious, but we're just going to retreat the same thing. So we'll become clear. From here, we can see in quite an interesting fashion how Kaufman's characterization of the identification of divinity associated with the displacement of man by himself in Nietzsche, and with the Nietzschean conception of progress, is fundamentally opposed to the pretensions to divinity, which Kofman, in smothered words, presents as characteristic of the SS. So another quote from smothered words. The deportees constantly felt that their belonging to the species was challenged because the will of those who suppose themselves to belong to a higher species, that of the gods, was to make them confuse themselves with animals through forcing them to live in conditions worse than those of animals. So in the latter, in the case of the SS as characterised by Kaufman, the identification of divinity is the outcome of their need to hold themselves upright in the face of that which is hard of existence, and is, essentially, if we read the material in a certain way, the outcome of their unconscious fantasy of having projectively identified animality, sufferance, and death into the devotee. In the former, however, with Nietzsche, the identification of divinity, in the sense of the reincorporation of the good image which man had projected to his exterior, giving rise to the conception of an elevated God, forms just one part of a broader inducative process. It runs, in Nietzsche's case, in the case of the SS, it runs as a pair with the affirmation of that which is hard in existence, with the reincorporation of an animality equally projected to the exterior, and with a more general reincorporation of all that which the cathartic remedy might have facilitated the avoidance of. So unlike the SS, Nietzsche is, due to instinctive capacity, able to sense a threat of a foundering weighing upon him without, however, dreading it or denying it, even as this generalized affirmation leads, in Kaufman's characterization, through to his deconstitution, such as a singular subject identical to itself in the course of the time, and through to his deconstitution, such as man, since this last has always presupposed a specific difference, assuring to the human species an identity which distinguishes it from others, from animality or from divinity. So it's associated with Nietzsche's breakdown, essentially, in 1994. In contrast to the classical Kleinian model of psychoanalytic process, where the dissolution of splits is the essential goal, since the integration of repressed material is imagined to strengthen the ego, the integrative process associated with the amorphity here is related in a direct and essential fashion to the deleterious, and to a breakdown in the continuity of the psychism or the emotional life of the individual. The character of the relation of this integrative process to the deleterious and ultimately to disintegration and breakdown can be clarified if we turn to a second and in some respects heterogeneous conception of Nietzsche's identification of divinity, which is operative in the text that we're looking at, so in the quakes at an explosion. And this is that of an identification with Denounces, assimilable to becoming and to a nature which is characterised elsewhere by Kaufman as indifference, anarchic and fortuitous mixture, absence of sense and unity, the reign without end of pure movement. The accomplishment of an identification with this figure, with becoming or Denounces, is presented by Kaufman, again summarising Nietzsche, such as being in fundamental antinomy to the cathartic remedy, which, in fact, serves as a means of calming the frenzy of the corribants, who, dispossessed of themselves and of their substantial identity, so as to not form but one with Denounces, with becoming, would have risked, without being so calmed, being totally disappropriated of themselves. It is on the basis of this identification, the accomplishment of which we can imagine might be facilitated by an entire labour of psychic reorganisation. So it's on the basis of this identification which the delight of the novel concept that tragically mentioned in the outset of the paper rests. So we can quote again a long passage from Explosion. Within the tragic spectacle, so differently to kind of the classical tragedy structure, a living, truly living being is situated beyond terror and pity, and it is no more with the hero in their misfortune with which they identify, but with life itself, with becoming. An identification which is associated not with the negative cathartic pleasure of being preventatively cleared out or lifted of two depressing positions, but a true delight at being not a being but a becoming, and correspondingly a delight at ruination. So I don't know, I'm going to carry on that's kind of, I find it hard to distinguish what Kaufman's introduced here from what's kind of just kind of running on Nietzsche, but yeah. So I'm going to skip forward to some material now, which is going to characterise how in the film, Unbeatable Deadbeat, so in the film in the text, what appears to happen is kind of a break, that the scientist is humiliated and then kind of breaks from the metaphysical search of truth, and then kind of collapses into being a clown and pursuing clownery. How you can kind of read that text in a certain way that emphasises that the dramatisation of his acting in the circus is actually in fundamental continuity to his interest in truth. So he doesn't kind of give up, but rather than speaking on stage for an audience, enacts it or performs it. But yeah, so I'm step 2. In contrast to the continuity between the scientific and the ludic or comic enterprises of the clown, and yet equate sets rationalism and laughter in a relation of complementarity. Laughter, such as tragedy and the medicine of the priests, who exploited the spectacle of suffering at the beginning of the text, is characterised as having a preservative function. Voltaire preserves himself from the melancholy which might win out to him through sarcastic irony. Voltaire and Nietzsche have in common their invention of an antidote to that which could have been the destruction of critical wit and rationalism pushed to the extreme. And this antidote is a laughter which saves them both from melancholic sadness and from pessimism. So we kind of moved on from the concept of tragedy to how that kind of relates to the interest in truth more broadly. So, however, rather than economising truth so as to facilitate the preservation of emotional life or psychism from breakdown, as with the tragedy of the cathartic scene, which seeks the denial or the projected avoidance of experience, the expedient of laughter indicates rather a transformation of the nature of the relation to experience. So we could say the denudation of its elevated quality, without its avoidance as such. So it doesn't relieve us of the experience in its kind of speculative structure. It changes the way we relate to it, it de-elevates it, but still let's see. This seems to be in part why, in spite of their association with irreverence, laughter and comedy are valorised by Kaufman as particularly complementary to both the integrative movement detailed earlier, defined by responsive fidelity to and affirmation of existence, and to the furthering of critical wit, to use a term from the final text, Quakes. This structure is inscribed in turn within developmental narrative. Nietzsche, for having pushed his critical wit further and more radically than Voltaire, and for having some centuries advanced over this last, has a corollary greatened need for laughter. While Nietzsche underlines his profound complicity with Voltaire, the invention of the counterpoison was, without a doubt, more necessary to him than to his double, since his rationalism and the resultant pessimism had in his case been so radical and so excessive that he had needed a genius remedy to render them tolerable. An Unbeatable Deadbeat, where the relationship between the scientific wit of the clown and its genius innovation in the circus is much less clear, characterises the tragic and melancholy as the two undesirable paths or states wherein, without recourse to laughter, one might founder. So, quote, "If you don't want to sink into the tragic or melancholy, you can only yourself contribute to making the earth turn with derision. While the threat of melancholy remains a constant, in and yet equates, it is rather pessimism against which it is coupled, and which, alongside melancholy, is that which, without the expedient of laughter, threatens to destroy critical wit and rationalism pushed to the extreme." So certain texts, Unbeatable Deadbeat included, do seem to invite a reader to find in laughter and comedy the crazed outcome of pessimism. So, and when the masks fall, there is nothing to do but laugh, would be characteristic of that to some degree. It is against these same, which and yet equate, seems to caution, through the characterisation of the developmental process detailed in the book, where laughter is complementary to the advancement of criticality, and where laughter is inscribed into a psychical economy dominated by the epistemophilic drive or will to truth, and set in the service of the intensification of that drive. So furthermore, the elaboration of this material is coupled in the Etiquettes with renewed analyses of both the concept of progress in Nietzsche and of the shift in theoretical attitude that takes place in his terminal identification with Denounces, as detailed above. It is as though, late in the day, there was an attempt by Kaufman at reaffirming her interest in and commitment to the theorisation of concepts of culture and development, which her deconstructive bearing seems at times to have overshadowed. Okay. It is interesting to consider how this developmental process, centred upon a pushing of critical wit, and is facilitated essentially by an attention to the means through which truth is economised, by a dissolution of psychic defences, and by the invention of novel means to stud the street in, the economisations and defences that we've developed naturally or spontaneously. So it's interesting how this might be held against Kaufman's critique of the philosophers of the Enlightenment in the essay Seductions. So this is just a quick kind of detour. There, it is implied that the direct correlate of the advances of the philosophers of the Enlightenment, of their dissolution of the assuring idealised objects offered by religious superstition, which exposes them to greater hardship on a psychic level, was a regressive recourse to an idealisation of sexual difference. So another long quote. The old theological motif of seduction by woman does not cease, in any case, to haunt literature before and far after the Revolution. At the very moment where religious institutions were crumbling from bottom to top, had the price to pay not in the maintenance, at least at a phantasmatic level, of the illusion of a certain permanence, that of the unshakable feminine nature. And this appeal to nature within Diderot, as within Rousseau, does it not simply contribute to renewing, as concerns women, the very religious prejudice which the philosophers of the Enlightenment had striven at the same time to destroy? To renewing and to better perpetuating them, since this time founded precisely in nature. It is this which would explain perhaps why that great grand débat, which the Revolution would have been, had ultimately done so little to ameliorate the situation of women and so little modified literature. So it's a bit of a long quote. But what I would like to emphasise is the model in which a loss of stability pursuant to the dissolution of the given prejudice, a dissolution itself resultant from the direction of criticality towards that prejudice, causes the consolidation of other kind of heterogeneous prejudices. The pushing of critical wit, then, is no more of a simple and linear process than the psychotherapy of an individual or of a group. The crumbling of such or such an institution or prejudice, which had served as a bulwark against anxiety, necessarily precipitates the reorganisation of collective defences in order to economise that liberated anxiety. And this reorganisation will tend towards the kind of reinvestment of existing bulwarks, unless novel expedients for the containment and modification of anxiety are in place. From here, we can see one of the values of an enterprise such as Kaufman's explosion, and of Kaufman's synthesisation of psychoanalytic and philosophical method more generally. The exposition of the psychic defences to which the most critical of our immediate forebears, consciously or unconsciously assure themselves in the process of the dissolution of idealisations, allows, in a certain sense, for the development of thought. Isn't a particular pathway open to us here, then, that of a sophistication of Kaufman's critical method through its synthesis with contemporary psychoanalytic thought and its application in turn to Kaufman herself, if we think of her as one of those critical predecessors, its application to her theories and to her theatre. It is interesting to think that, I'm going to move on to the end now actually. It's interesting to think that such a development of thought, driven by fidelity to critical wit, to kind of commitment to an epistemophilic drive, would have as its outcome transformation and immaturity well before any kind of advent to truth, and that advent to truth would be kind of displaced on the truth. So, how would all this better equip us to approach the question of the nature of Kaufman's identification with Galileo? We can say that Kaufman's critique of tragic belief, coupled with her critique of idealism, idealisation, and psychic defences more generally, precipitates a destabilisation of the psychism of the reader of their rational life, depriving them of their aplomb and of their assured position in relation to truth as in relation to any other thing. This would appear in some respects to move her towards a relativism, no longer experienced such as an awful spectre to be dreaded, to choose by somewhere, and so to alienate her from a Galileo who, head held high, is able to remain certain of the value of the truth of the heliocentric model, certain of its priority over religious superstition. And we can also say, however, that this destabilisation is not undertaken for its own sake, nor for the sake of a willful movement towards relativism as such, which is the consequence of a rationalism pushed to the extreme, which, in the surface of the epistemophilic drive, of an intensely connected infantile curiosity, attacks conventional psychic defences, the shelter of truths far too displeasing, in order to open onto the content, or lack thereof, behind them, immoralist truths which cast off all security, shaping the very being of man from bottom to top. The apparent antinomy of the two references to Galileo can be taken up in this light. The first reference, and yet it continues to turn in an unbeatable deadbeat, in the same moment to which it affirms the irreverence of the universe to man, which says that the earth is a derisory sphere which continues to turn even when you yourself no longer turn so roundly or so smoothly, appeals to the capacity of the repetition implicit to the ludic mode of the clown to allow for a renegotiation of that reference, a different experience of it, a non-impression of it. It affirms the amorphity as a response to the sentiment of the world's collapsing and the earth ceasing to turn. The second reference, and yet it quakes, elides in a striking fashion the reality of Copernican heliocentrism, with a reality of the Nietzschean earthquake indicative of the ecstasy of becoming, which continues to quake regardless of the salvational fictions which are drawn up so as to occult it and to master its contradictions. I'm just going to quote a little bit from the Space of the Caesura. So Kofman writes that which Nietzsche shows is that philosophy, from Socrates onwards through its own path, that of concept, possesses the same desire as tragedy, curing the it's kind of just repetition of the first bit, but it's still good to have that. Curing the wounded regard or the wounded gaze, in mastering the contradictions of becoming through the invention of salvational fictions, being, substance, the subject, thing itself, etc. The second reference, rather than serving as a willful contradiction of the first, since there the cessation of the turning of the earth had been assimilated to its collapse, elaborates the same logic. The continued turning of the earth is its derivative, essentially, from affirmation of its quaking. The sustainment of the psychism of the emotional life of the spectator, in the wholly of the theatre implicit to a philosophy of becoming, in a similar fashion is contingent upon the affirmation of the experience of ruination. The identification, actually, I think stop there. I think the rest is just really a repetition of kind of the same material. Yeah.